Good evening. My name is Elliot Toda. I'm the Vice President of the congregation. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening to hear from Moran Stern about this summer's 50-day war, the Israel-Gaza conflict, the Israel-Hamas conflict, and the many other names that it's received since and that it will continue to receive. For those of you who have been to our Members Teaching Members series before, it's very nice to see you again. Thank you for coming. And for those of you whose first time it may be here, our Members Teaching Members series is intended to highlight the vast knowledge base of the membership of Magen David, as well as the extended knowledge base of the peers and colleagues of our members. In this case, Moran is actually a good friend of mine. And we spoke several months ago about Moran coming to speak here tonight. Moran is an adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Studies. He's previously lectured as well at American University, and he's regularly featured in the news, both in writing and network television, on everything from The Atlantic to Al Jazeera and beyond. So if you turn on your TVs one night and you see Moran on there, you'll be able to say, I saw that guy live. When Moran and I spoke several months ago before the summer about what he was going to be discussing, we actually centered on a topic related to the religious and the secular in Israel, and how those two groups often interact and how they shape Israeli life, Israeli politics, and beyond. That was in May. Since May, some things happened in Israel, and Moran was actually there for them. Combining the fact that he experienced them firsthand and the unique perspective that he has, focusing on Jewish and Israeli matters in his everyday affairs, we decided that it was most appropriate that he would in fact provide some perspective on the conflict over the summer, not only from our perspective sitting here many thousands of miles away, but from the perspective of Israelis and everybody in between. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Moran to the podium.
You all hear me well? Yes. Yeah. So the last time I was on Al Jazeera, they wanted to ask me about the boycott divestment, sanction movement. So in a very good Al Jazeera fashion, when I looked at the editing, it was 3 seconds by me protecting Israel, and the rest was why Israel is so bad. You know, it's a good Al Jazeera fashion of hosting those who criticize Israel. All right. So first of all, I want to thank the congregation and Elliot for providing me this opportunity. And I can also, when looking around the people who entered the room, I can certainly say that I'm not the only Ashkenazi here. So it's already well. Anyway, let's start. Today is, as you all know, is September 11th, a date that have changed, I would say, international affairs to a great degree. And it's a moment in history that immediately triggers all kinds of names and so forth, but of course Al-Qaeda is one of them. And from Al-Qaeda we have now this creature that beheading heads all over, ISIS, or in Arabic, Dawlat al-Islam wal-Iraq wal-Sham, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, which is Syria in Arabic. But Hamas is not Al-Qaeda. Hamas is not ISIS. This is important to understand. Yes, both are Sunni, the offshoot or the mainstream of Islam, Sunni Islamic movements, both aspiring to have an Islam-based polity. They both use violence, we know as jihad, against those who they define as heretic, and it doesn't matter if they are Shiite, or if they are Christians, or if they are Jews. But Hamas is looking to do all these things in a particular manner. Hamas believes in a state, as we know what modern states are, but it has to be an Islamic-based state. He combines religion and state for a particular nation, the Palestinians. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, are global movements. And they are anti the idea of a state. There is a nation that has to control the world, and this is the the Islamic nation. This is why what you see today in the Middle East is the destruction of borders. Everything that is border-oriented is against the mentality of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Hamas has no aspirations to rule Egypt, okay? So this is an ISIS and Al-Qaeda do. So this is an important thing to remember. Now moving on, I want to, these are the two images, the Hamas on the left and ISIS fighters on the right, and this is important despite the similarities in appearance. I think that ideology is very important too. Now, these are two maps that I provided. One is of Israel in General Israel, the Palestinian Authority, with the Gaza Strip. And this is more focused on the Gaza Strip for those of you who are less familiar with the geography. What we've experienced over the summer is essentially the third round of the last 6 years in clashes between Israel, Hamas, but also other organizations within the Gaza Strip, such as the Islamic Jihad and all kinds of resistance movements, as they like to call themselves. Being a war of 50 days, and I use the word term, although official Israel does not use the term war, makes this exchange of fire essentially one of Israel's longest exchange of fires. I mean, this is longer than the Yom Kippur War, which gives us a lot of food for thought on how new wars will take place in that region. Now, before I go into the Gaza Strip and what happened over the summer, I want to go back to 2006. This is something that I want you all to put in your mind as we proceed, as I proceed with my talk today. In 2006, what was happening in the summer of 2006, I'm sure you remember, Israel and Hezbollah clashing in the border of southern Lebanon. The Israeli public, the international media, everyone slaughtered the decision makers, right? The chief of staff left afterwards. Essentially, it was Olmert's goodbye or political decline. Amir Peretz was the security minister by then. He's doing something now. I don't know what he's doing. People have disappeared from the radar after this war. They paid dearly for what then was perceived as the failures of the war. But in perspective of now, 2014, 8, 9 years after the war, when was the last time you heard that Hezbollah was shooting at Israel? So Israel was able to establish almost unprecedented deterrence against Hezbollah that will expire at one point. But give Netanyahu today 8, 9 years with Hamas, he buys it. So time and perspective are very important when you look at conflicts in the Middle East. And that moves me to my next point, which is the conception I just talked about a little bit today at the beginning, the perception of victory. Here in the United States, and I've been here for a couple of years, and it fascinates me, victory is the American soldier in Baghdad putting down the statue of Saddam Hussein, stuck in the American flag, and sing, I don't know, Elvis Presley. That's not the Middle East. Okay? The Middle East are wars of 300, 400, 500 years. They are absolute wars. They are existential wars. Especially when you deal with movements that are so religiously driven like Hamas. And I want to leave aside a moment the popular narrative that I've heard over and over again from the Israeli government this summer of, we are Israelis celebrating life, we are fighting against an enemy that celebrates death. Okay, great. But I want to look at it from a bit more academic perspective, from a socio-political perspective, and say that what we've experienced over the summer is a clash of civilizations. I have no other way to describe what we've seen in Israel that summer. a constructive society versus a paralyzed, victimized society, and I don't need to tell you which one is who. And when I say constructive, I mean Zionist, because Zionism in its essence is a constructive movement versus mentality of refugeism. And what we have seen above all is what I coin as the Gaza syndrome, which means that Gaza is not only a geographical spot on the Mediterranean, but rather it is a socio-political economic syndrome that is characterized by the total absence of political and social accountability on the part of Gazans, and I do not distinguish Hamas and Gazans here, on the part of Gazans, and I will elaborate on this later, and the international community. And it is being perpetuated, and also Israel, by the way, and this syndrome is being perpetuated for years through the Gazans' political and social deficiencies. Simply look at their leaders, a distorted set of priorities, which I will elaborate on later, decades of Gazans' absolute dependency almost on foreign aid for the basic needs, education and sanitation. Israel, that never had, and I don't think will ever have, a policy on Gaza, a clear strategy and policy, what are we doing with this strip of land? And you have the international community that unconditionally provides assistance to Palestinians in general and to Gaza in particular. And my criticism over the international community, led by countries that believe in liberal values such as free market and so forth, is the basic rule is return on investment. Okay, you invest, what do you get in return? So these are the things that perpetuate the Gaza syndrome, and the conclusion is that we will have another round. We will have another round because all the conditions are still there and very much alive. Look now how everyone are running with the suitcases full of cash to reconstruct Gaza. Hamas is there, and the reconstruction of tunnels has already begun. Now, I'll start with the Israeli government. As I said now, Israel has no Gaza policy. And that has always been the case, by the way. So it's nothing that is particular to this administration or the one before it. And I would also elaborate that unlike different administrations, this government has no Palestinian policy whatsoever. They just don't know what to do or don't want to do anything in regard to the Palestinian issue. But what's interesting is that it goes to this administration, it goes to the administration before, is that paradoxically, despite the previous clashes that Israel had with Hamas, Israel prefers to see Hamas controls Gaza. It prefers to see Hamas controls Gaza because from an Israeli perspective, the alternative might be much worse. They might be ISIS, they might be Al-Qaeda. And Israel at least wants an address, a clear address. Who is the landlord of this problematic piece of land? So the fear, the way I see it, the fear that Hamas will be replaced by ISIS, by Al-Qaeda, it's a mechanism that, or it's an idea that has very little ground, or it's very problematic. Because Hamas was capable, or at least demonstrated, maybe we don't like the way that it did it, but it demonstrated its ability to rule, govern civil society. We might criticize the way it did it, but Hamas does it. Al-Qaeda, ISIS are not capable of doing that. They are not capable of holding a territory, develop institutions, and deliver. So the fear that if Hamas will fall and be replaced by Al-Qaeda, it won't hold. It won't hold for a moment. Now, I now want to shift from the Israeli government, because I want to go, as I mentioned, from the local to the region to the international. I want to look at the Israeli public, and I think you'll be quite interested in what I have to say here. So from the Israeli public perspective, and this map shows the range of missiles from the Gaza Strip, right here, all the way essentially to Tel Aviv. So this is Jerusalem. So the distances are here, also with the names of the type of the rockets, but that less matters at this point. From the Israeli public perspective, we talk about at least all the way to the city of Ashkelon, 14 years of rocket shelling since the year 2000. This is 7 years, by the way, before Hamas takes power in Gaza. Now, in the period of these 14 years, we've seen over 6,000 rockets, all kinds, that have been launched from Israel. And the Israeli narrative, the public narrative is, look, we've disengaged from Gaza. We left them alone, right? We gave them their freedom and so forth, and what we get in return, we get fired. This is the narrative of many right-wingers in Israel. This is partly true. Okay, Israel very much controls Gaza. The evacuation of the Gush Katif people, these are the settlements, the Israeli settlements within the Gaza Strip in the north and in the south, was a monumental moment in Israeli history. And I would emphasize you that despite the images, and it was a very tough moment for the Israeli society, nevertheless, despite the tough images, the rough images and the emotions and so forth, and the orange color, by the way, that's the color that characterized, or that those who were evacuated adopted, the orange color. Despite that, there was an overwhelming public support for this engagement from Gaza. Gaza is, in Israeli slang, is nicknamed or is synonymous to the lowest place on earth. When you want to tell someone in Israel, I had enough from you, you tell him, go to Gaza, lech le'aza. So the moment of disengaging from Gaza, which maybe it's the root of La'azazel, yeah. But anyway, disengaging from Gaza was a moment that was overwhelmingly supported in the Israeli public, demonstrated the ability to not only decide, also execute the national interest and the rule of law over small political party interests. And not surprisingly, it was under a leader that was fit for the Middle East, I think, in terms of mentality of Ariel Sharon, who many in Israel today miss very much for different reasons. Now, Hamas came to power, as you all know, in 2006. Hamas won the elections, and in 2007, forcibly coup, very violently, by the way, coup Fatah member, Fatah, the main party within the Palestinian Liberation Organization, threw their members out of roofs, and I clearly remember how the Fatah people were running literally in underwears to the Israeli crossing of Kerem Shalom and the Erez Block. But anyway, the election of Hamas, and this is another thing which I think is very important, reflected something organic, something authentic within Palestinian society, in Gaza. The rise of Hamas, and this is again, you know, it's a very Palestinian narrative and a Western narrative. Hamas rose to power because Israel, because of the occupation, because of, Hamas rose to power because the malfunctioning of the Fatah to deliver to their own people. First and foremost. So first of all, the accountability falls on the Palestinians. Hamas rose to power because it had enough from the corruption and the inability of the Palestinian leadership, back then Yasser Arafat and then Abu Mazen, to deliver. And this is why Hamas rose to power. And having him as something organic and authentic within Palestinian society, reflects something within Palestinian society, makes the idea of removing Hamas totally imaginary. Hamas will be there, and it's there to stay. And I will, of course, elaborate also on that a bit later. Now, before the war, before this conflict, Hamas had about 6,000 to 8,000 rockets from different kinds, and also thousands of mortar shells, which proved to be, by the way, highly lethal. So the casualties, the Israeli casualties in this campaign resulted not from being hit by a Russian-made Grad missile, but rather by homemade mortar shells, especially envelope of Gaza, of these kibbutzes and villages around Gaza. And during the operation, of course, and we'll talk about it soon, was the issue of the tunnels. Now, from the Israeli perspective, and I'm still talking about the Israeli public here, from the Israeli public perspective, having 14 years of rocket shelling, knowing that there is an organization that holds 6,000 to 8,000 rocket shells in its inventory. Later on, of course, knowing that it dug in pretty successfully tunnels that threaten the lives of Israeli civilians, the perception of Israel, of the Israeli public, was of a just war. And what you saw is an overarching support and will, by the way, of the Israeli population to do whatever it takes to totally stop the rocket firing and to create a situation where there is a radical change of equation between Israel and Hamas. And I personally cannot recall anything similar. The last thing I remember such a massive support was in 2002 with the Operation Defensive Shield, the second Intifada, where the IDF essentially raised Jenin and solved the issue of suicide bombers and terror coming from the West Bank. And guess who was the prime minister back then? It was Sharon. And it is extremely important because the Israeli public has direct influence on the duration of war in Israel and on decision making. The Israeli public, as you know, and this is kind of one of the paradoxes in Israel, despite the fact that Israel fights over its own territory sometimes or defends its own civilians, there is very limited tolerance to the loss of soldiers, as opposed to other countries who fight miles away from their home, and the tolerance for losses is much greater. It will take thousands before something happens and someone, start demonstrating in front of the White House, for example, or in Downing Street in London. So within Israel, the public support was enormous, and you could see that despite the loss of soldiers, and despite the suspect that was during the war, that one lieutenant was kidnapped, there was a restraint, there was an acceptance, because it is a just war. We have to change the equation. It cannot take anywhere. When we take whatever means we need, and we will support fully the government, and we support fully the military, which is almost a default situation in Israel, to do whatever it takes to change the equation. The end of the operation, therefore, that did not change, as of now, the equation so much, have created the impression of a too early. It was too early. The Israeli public believed that it was too early, and it's something that except of the margins of the right or the margins of the left, the mainstream Israel, including rightists and leftists, felt that it was too early, that more could have been done. And what you saw is a shift between standing behind the Israeli government to start criticizing it heavily. And it is not a surprise to see the crazy decline in approval rate of Netanyahu after the war from mid-high 80s a few months ago to the low 30s just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And leaders in Israel in the past have paid dearly when the public perceived them as not leading strategically well enough the country, from Golda Meir to Olmert, which I mentioned, and so forth. So, very, very important point. Who, on the other hand, experienced an increase in the rating approval? Of course, the Liebermans and the Bennetts that offer nothing, just blah, 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 blah. Yeah, but they have no idea of what are we going to do with Gaza, or what the policy will be. There is no solution for the day after. And that's that. Now, with all that being said, with all the perception of it too early and we could have done more and we should have done more, the Israeli public shows zero tolerance to the idea of the military staying in Gaza to do whatever needs to be done. The experience of Lebanon, where Israel had the security strip from 84 to 2000, And by the way, the limbo of the West Bank goes deep within the Israeli public. We don't want to be there again. Deeper on the level of the Israeli public, and again, I would say, has to do with the idea of a just war, and that we have to support each other also, which is another obviously very interesting Jewish/Israeli characteristic, is again the unparalleled ability to unite, and just putting everything aside and uniting around a cause that most of society, as I mentioned, perceived as just. And one example will be of the Golani soldier, the infantry soldier, Max Steinberg, an American who came as a lone soldier. Probably many of you heard about him. He came as a lone soldier, so in Israel, in the IDF, we have all kinds of soldiers who come from different motivations, Jewish, of course, to serve. From Australia to Canada to Russia and so forth. They come to serve, but their families live abroad, so they've been adopted by a kibbutz or by a foster family. And as you know, obviously in Judaism, you bury the day, the same day before nightfall, and his family could not make the trip on time. 30,000 people attended his funeral. Okay, this ability to support is unparalleled. 30,000 people, just think about the Israeli population and make the it's incredible in a funeral of a soldier. And there were other great examples, I would say more joyful one is a guy named Doron Elbaz, who opened in the south on the way to Gaza with his 12-year-old daughter. They opened a lemonade stand to start distributing lemonade for the soldiers who are coming down, and he developed it into an industry where so many people volunteered. They were making, from cups of lemonade, 30,000 dishes of food per day, barbecuing. And you know, I think, by the way, that the most interesting image is the one on the right hand, on the bottom of this Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox man, who is a masseuse. He never served in the military. He felt bad that there are others who essentially protect him, and he came to offer his services to the soldiers by providing a free massage. So, you know, of course, Jewish and creativity goes hand in hand, and you see again, the ability to unite and support each other after a cause. I can also say that I personally went to visit a family that lost one of their sons in the war in Gaza, a family that I never met. I don't know who the people are, but the images on the Friday's morning newspaper touched me so hard and so deep that I went to visit, and I spoke with them. And you know, in Israel at these moments, everyone has his own way to participate in the war effort, if you will, and that was my small contribution. So, as I mentioned, the perception, excuse me, of just war on the other hand, combined with the public unity behind the government and the military in the beginning, versus the government goes and negotiates with Hamas under fire, while fire is still going on. And the leaving of or ending the operation, what was perceived as too early, created a schism or a rupture between the Israeli public and the government. But what really exploded the Israeli public anger was the issue of the tunnels. Now, I will tell you a few interesting things about tunnels, because I've been following these tunnels at least as much as I could since Cascade operation in 2008. When I was already, after my military service, I was in Israel, and I remember when the tunnels were revealed back then, and I thought to myself, how distorted it is to dig down. I mean, usually cultures build up, right? Pyramids and all, you dig down. I mean, it shocked me, the idea of the tunnels. 32 of them or so were destroyed, but there was very little, supposedly this is what's coming up now, there was very little information on these tunnels. The military echelon already prepared itself for the investigation committee, and already through the operation said, look, we told you there are tunnels, but you told us you want to hear about Iran, but we tried to push it and it didn't work. So, you know, there is a clash between the government and the military on whose fault that we didn't knew about the tunnels. Some of the tunnels, and I don't know if you know, have essentially reached under the defense into Israeli villages on the envelope of Gaza. Some of them are just a couple of miles away from the border, which again, the idea of Hamas not targeting civilians that you hear oftentimes among ignorance and among pro-Palestinians is totally not true, because here you have a tunnel that its exit point is in someone's kitchen, and it's not a military base, so there you go. The tunnels in this region near the Mediterranean are easy to dig because of the type of the soil, so you can dig until you get to the underground water level. And Hamas viewed the tunnels as a national project, and it was willing to invest millions from foreign aid in order to build and fortify this system of tunnels, which, by the way, proved very successful with the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit. It was through a tunnel that went all the way to a military base. It was a project with top classification, so Hamas divided the system of tunnels among commanders, and every person knew exactly his tunnel, not knowing who's near him, so they really learned what they are doing. And it was an industry that employed hundreds of Gazans. Nearly 200 of them, by the way, were kids that died in constructing the tunnels, but of course no one talks about that because, again, collapsing and you know, this is a very dangerous type of labor. During the short-lived era of Morsi, Mohammed Morsi, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood president, we saw an expansion of this project and their fortification. Because Morsi allowed a lot of things to go through the tunnels. He looked at the other side. He was less busy with that, and now with Fatah al-Sisi, the new president, we see a different attitudes towards the tunnels. The tunnels have three main uses. One of them is economic, and Hamas has an interest in maintaining these tunnels in order to smuggle everything from strawberries to sheep, to cars. I think I have an image here of a car going through the tunnel. Because it taxes, first of all, taxation, and second of all, absolute monopoly over supply and demand in Gaza Strip of all kinds of goods. So Hamas has an interest to maintain these tunnels industry. And there are also tunnels that are VIP tunnels. So let's say you want to come to Gaza, if you want, and cross from the Egyptian side of a tunnel, you can choose a tunnel. You can have one which is air-conditioned, with a cell phone reception, and one that you can go with your ship like this, and yeah, it's a bit less cozy. Another function that the tunnels have are to move terrorists and fighters from one point to another, and the third one, which is relatively new, is to launch rockets. And this is something that Hamas and the other organizations have learned from previous operations where Israel was able, through unmanned aerial vehicle or something like that, to target the launchers, even if the rocket already left, at least launch them. So now you just open a little door, shoot and hide. So this is a third function. And within the ability to construct, and my brother is an architect, and one of the things he told me, I told him, what do you think? He'd been to Gaza many times. I told him, what do you think about the war? He said, I'm impressed by these tunnels. It's incredible. Seriously, he said, it's amazing. Professionals. And Hamas, to be able to construct something like this, shows us that he is the landlord in Gaza. When you look at the delegation who went to Cairo to negotiate a ceasefire with Israel, you had Hamas sent tops. Musa Abu Marzouk was there, Osama Hamdan. And so to make it diplomatically correct, the PLO, Fatah, has also sent someone, and they sent Azam el-Ahmed. He was like the head of the delegation. Someone who is, how would you say, Askan, a Palestinian, how would you say Askan in English? He was a minister of paper in the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. But it has to be, so to show you that the people who are running the show in Cairo from the Palestinian side were Hamas. Now, To survive, even when you're a landlord of Gaza, to survive, Hamas needs strong support from the local population, because eventually, unlike ISIS or Al-Qaeda, who gets recruits from Belgium and France, if they want, or from Bosnia and Afghanistan, Hamas needs the local population to recruit men, okay, to operate, and also to fight opposition and rivals within the Gaza Strip, all kinds of players that want to bite from the power of Hamas. And it goes back to my point that the rise of Hamas is authentic to the Gazan people, and this artificial separation in the international media, in the public debate in the West of, oh, there is Hamas, and then there is the Palestinians, and why do you kill Palestinians? Yeah, there is a big issue, and I can elaborate on the Q&A of the death of civilians, but the separation between the local population and Hamas is artificial. They go in many respects hand in hand. Now, because of that, you cannot uproot Hamas. You cannot uproot ideas. But what you can do, and this is what the Israeli public expected from the government and the military to do, is to cut the wings, the military wings of Hamas. So the idea cannot fly and smuggle weapons and become violent. So the destruction of its military capabilities, that's what had to be, the way I and others perceive it, to be the end goal of this operation. Now, the key word between Israel and Hamas, on the other hand, is deterrence. That's how to say, deterrence. But the problem with deterrence, that the moment you establish a deterrence, the clock starts to run back. It's like putting, ice in the sun. You've frozen it, eventually it will melt down, and you'll have another round of violence. And these rounds of violence are very interesting, because here you have a state, sovereign state, fights against a non-sovereign state or political entity, which makes the things very, very asymmetric. You have a sovereign, well-organized state fighting a sovereign non-state actor with significant military capabilities. And for Israel, it is imperative to try and research, define, target, and try to harm the structure of the decision makers and institutions of Hamas. And when I say institutions, that means also leaders, in order to establish deterrence. And in the past, we've seen Israel doing that through targeted assassinations, through trying to prevent shipments of weaponry through the Red Sea, delaying transfer of payments to the Gaza Strip via the Palestinian Authority, and so forth. Hamas, unlike a state that has much more to lose economically and so forth, is willing, and it was very interesting to see that Hamas was willing to engage in a war of attrition, which tells a very interesting thing on the way Hamas develops. And in such a war of attrition, the goal is to create a constant sense of uncertainty, of insecurity among the Israeli civilian population. And internationally, Hamas was very much happy, quote unquote, or maybe without quote unquote, to see the deaths of its own people, because it serves a very clear end. It creates legitimacy, it hides the faces behind the black mask, and shifts the attention to civilian casualty, which are heartbreaking in the West. Now, this round, however, suggests, I believe, that deterrence is insufficient. Hamas proved itself to be, in this round, more organized, more skilled, more equipped, and more motivated, by the way. Unlike Cast-led, for example, or Pillar of Cloud. No, Pillar of Cloud, there was no ground operation, but Cast-led operation. And Hamas was able to obtain and manufacture thousands of rocket shells and launch them throughout the entire 50 days, deeper and deeper into Israeli territory. So again, the demand is to change the equation against Hamas, to uproot its military capabilities, but I'm always cautious and remind you that time is a very important element here in terms of how we assess the success or the failure on none of the above of Israel in this operation. Now, from the Israeli perspective, and this is something that I came across in many circles in Israel is that Netanyahu proved himself to be, may I use the word impotent? Okay, I just used it. Well, we knew that he has a problem to move on things socially in Israel. He has a problem to move things economically in Israel. We knew he has a problem to move things politically in Israel, but now he proved himself to move things strategically in Israel. And Netanyahu was determined to finish this war with the formula of quiet for quiet. And quiet for quiet formula might be good for movements like Hamas, but it's very bad for a state. A state changes equations when it fights against a non-state actor as Hamas. The strategic reality had to change. And the Israeli cabinet, well, you know, the close circle of Lieberman and Bennett and Livni is there. Their war was mostly via Facebook, which is ridiculous on their part, a lot of leaking to the media, a huge rupture within the Israeli cabinet. Netanyahu attacked his members of cabinet I think it was really a moment that was never there before. He attacked in front of the cameras his cabinet members. And my point is that the Israeli public today is worried. Is worried not because Hamas have rockets, because it feels leadershipless. It feels that they cannot trust the people in power, and you know what, worse, there is no alternative. And Netanyahu's biggest challenge, if he indeed wants to be the longest-serving Israeli prime minister ever, beating Ben-Gurion in this regard, and that's one of his ambitions, he'll have to win the Israeli public again, and this is going to be much more difficult than winning over Hamas, trust me. He will have to gain their support again. Now Hamas, look, Hamas hoped to kill hundreds of soldiers, and by the way, the number of soldiers, I believe, was 64 total in, excuse me? 60? 65? Yeah, there were a couple who died from injuries just recently, so yeah, maybe the number a bit higher, but that's much more than the 10 who died during Kasled, where Israel was deeper in the Gaza Strip, and 8 of them died in a friendly exchange of fire. So, you know, it shows you that Hamas did some homework since Kasled. He also hoped to kill dozens of civilians. None of the above happened. Hamas was, I believe, surprised from the resilience of the Israel home front, and this is something that the Arab world never learns, the resilience of the home front, of the public. And indeed, you have southerners who flee from their homes, but people should remember that also during the Lebanon war, northerners fled. So it's nothing new here. It's sad, I think it's a strategic threat to Israel, but also in 2006, people fled. And Hamas did not come with any significant achievements, both in the negotiations and in the battlefield. And the problem is, which is not really good for Israel, that Hamas must demonstrate, it must bring back home, some kind of a gift to its people. Because also an organization like Hamas has to create some legitimacy with the local population. And if it brings nothing, how can you explain now all this destruction? And Hamas must bring, wanted at least to bring some achievement for the destruction. He didn't get it so far. But what Hamas did get is that all of a sudden we have a 9-state Israel with the mediation of Egypt as the main mediators. And this is interesting. Look, in this map, the map of the Middle East, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, to the Gulf, Israel, Gaza Strip, we have Erdogan near Turkey, we have Sisi, the new president, switched to Hugo Boss suit from his uniforms, and we have the Sheikh Tamim bin Khalifa Thani of Qatar. And what we've seen in general is a silence in the Arab world. You haven't seen mass demonstration in Amman or in Cairo or in, well, whatever is left in some cities in Syria. But what I want to focus on, which was for me very, very interesting, the struggle between Egypt and Turkey over the duration of this conflict. So since the overthrow of Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, the relations, or there is a geopolitical struggle between Turkey and Egypt over influencing the Middle East, and this is something not new. It was always been there. It comes up and down, and here we have it again. These two giants trying to fit into the same room. The Egyptian military, which is the strongest institution in this country that runs the show, and Sisi as its head, have a total disdain of Erdogan because of his support of the Muslim Brotherhood, because of his support for Morsi. And today, I believe that there are no ambassadors in both countries. So Turkey has this hobby of recalling ambassadors from everywhere. And so I think the situation in Egypt, as far as I know, is the same today. Now, Turkey has a problem because its relations with Egypt are tense, with Saudi Arabia are tense, and with Saudi Arabia by default you get the United Arab Emirates. Its relations with Israel are tense. Nothing is rosy. So all this inhibits the capacity or the ability of Turkey to be a significant regional player in the region. So it aims at what generates a lot of interest and popularity, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And since, I would say, 2005, that's a year of change, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has become an instrument in the Turkish foreign policy and the way it tries to penetrate this region. Erdogan's now, with the overthrow of Morsi, trying to be the new patron of Hamas. And Turkey, along with Qatar, pushed Hamas between 5 and 6 times to refuse for ceasefire proposals that were backed by the Egyptians, the Israelis, and the Americans. And what you have here is a cynical use in the blood of Palestinians on behalf of Turkey and Erdogan. For what? To promote regional status and prestige, to divert the Turkish public opinion away from the all corruption scandals that Erdogan and his son were involved in. And as a nice instrument, guess what we had in Turkey on August 10? Presidential elections. Who ran? Erdogan. Who won? Erdogan. Let's talk about the conflict, let alone all the corruption allegations and so forth. Okay, I'll run quickly. I have 5 minutes, and that's exactly what I need. The international community. Look, the international community, business as usual, from the Israel rights to defend itself to the myth of no proportional use of power, Israel should use power proportionally, to massacre, to condemnation, to genocide, to war crimes, to United Nations Human Rights Council, of course. The United States, on the one hand, there was an unconditional support by action. We saw the Congress appropriating fast aid to Israel. But also, there was a verge of this characteristic to American foreign policy recently with the Middle East. I call it the PlayStation attitude. Turn off everything, mommy. I had enough. I can't see this blood anymore. It's too much blood for me. I had enough. This is a place that you cannot stop things oftentimes when they happen. It doesn't work like this. And this is something that I've identified, at least, which is, in a way, almost diplomatically speaking, irresponsible. Now, there was no constructive approach to solve the Gaza syndrome. As I mentioned, the Turks, the Qataris, the Americans, the Europeans, all the gang will, and the Israelis too, will deliver money for the reconstruction of Gaza. There was no system of sticks and carrots. How do I, for what I give, I get back? I would also say with the American concept that Obama referred to Israel and he used the word Gaza in the same line. And Gaza, as I mentioned, means Hamas, and that's kind of tricky when you place Hamas and Israel on the same line. Now, where we go from here? So we will meet hopefully again in a lecture, but not in reality, in the next round of violence between the two. We will see the crisis between the government and the public, I think deepens, and now other issues might trigger this sense of disappointment from the government. It doesn't have to be necessarily an investigation committee over this conflict. And I would also say that the Israeli public now will have, in a way, you can understand, a fear of disengaging from the West Bank. And when I was asked, do you think that this engagement was a bad idea for Gaza, I always said, no, we just did not implement it properly. So when we implement it over the Gaza Strip, let's at least learn what we did not do well and then implement it if we decide to implement it. But I think today it's off the agenda on the Israeli public. Now, there will be the Human Rights Council. Professor William Shadis, a Canadian anti-Israeli hardcore, will lead it, but this is not surprising when you have members such as, what did I have here? Algeria, Congo, Cuba, China, Kuwait, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Sierra Leone, United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, African states, and so forth as members of the UN Human Rights Council. Israel, one thing that I heard, 2 minutes, there is a problem if Israel don't have if Israel don't have a peace process, it affects Gaza. It's bullshit. Hamas would fight Israel with or without peace process. When there was progress with the negotiations between Israel and Fatah, what did Hamas did? Rockets. Don't forget me, I'm here. You have 6,000 to 8,000 rockets to launch them, not to plant, daisies in them. Okay? There is no resistance with a capital R. There is no Hamas. So the idea that Israel must now go fast with Abu Mazen, this is not the reason why this conflict, this one balance have happened. Long-term solution, 3 layers. First of all, paralysis of Hamas, as I mentioned, militarily. There must be, on the other hand, some diplomatic channel, at least openly, with Fatah and the PLO and Abu Mazen, but that requires the change of the Israeli coalition. So that means that we might have to go for elections. There is also maybe interesting thing. I mean, another thing, kind of a default in the West. Oh, let's look at the Arab Peace Initiative. Okay, but it needs to be revised because it talks about the right of return, which is you cannot execute it. I talked about the reconstruction of Gaza, which